Hey guys, so as long as I can remember, I've always been a big fan of HBO. The thing I like about them compared to other brands like Netflix or NBC, all the compatible and competitors, is that they prioritize quality over quantity. HBO doesn't do that many shows a year, but when they do, odds are it's going to be a banger. So, and basically, this video is just me talking about my top 10 HBO shows. Um, this is so. Before I start, I'm gonna name some honorable mentions because these shows, if it wasn't for the later seasons or the most recent seasons, they'd definitely be on the list. But the later seasons are so bad that it booted the rest of them off the list. First off, I'm going to name the obvious Game of Thrones, which started out as probably like one of the most cleverly written shows based on one of the best book series ever made, completely fell apart in its later seasons because it didn't stick to the source material. And the writers of the show were like, we could do better. Turns out they couldn't. And so seasons 1 through 4 are amazing. 5 through 6, pretty good. 7 has its moments. 8, awful. The less and less they focus on the books, the more disjointed it becomes. So that's not making a list. Also, True Detective. Uh, Season 1 is probably one of the best shows I've ever watched. Season 2 is very boring. Season 3 is pretty good. Surprisingly good compared to Season 2. Season 4, boo. Season 4 sucks. It's awful. Can't even believe it's called True Detective. It was so bad. So that's not making a list either. Now on to my actual list. So this isn't based on how, like, best of worst or worst to best. This is kind of just based from the year it came out. So I'm going to start off, at the beginning and then work my way to the most recent shows. So in 1999, we got The Sopranos, which I think is a show that completely revolutionized television. It was one of those first cable dramas that really set itself apart from your network dramas. It took a lot of risks, very adult oriented, like kids should not watch it. You have violence, you have like episode to episode plot lines, characters who change over time, and it just it took itself seriously, and it didn't need to hold the audience's hand because it realized the audience who was watching it is smart enough to pick up on the little things throughout the show. They have so many themes and just plots you could dissect and stuff. And the fact that people are still talking about the show 25 years later shows the lasting impact it has on American culture. It's it's great. So yeah, The Sopranos definitely made the list. And not only would HBO not be the same today, but television itself would not be the same today if it wasn't for The Sopranos. Moving on, we have Curb Your Enthusiasm, which kind of like Sopranos did for dramas. I think Curb Your Enthusiasm kind of did for comedy. It was on HBO, so um, being by Larry David, the creator of Seinfeld, it's kind of similar to Seinfeld, except it's a lot more risque and rated R. They could get away with a lot of stuff they couldn't get away with on network television. Watching Larry David on the show, you feel like slightly embarrassed just watching him because the stuff he says and does, it's very embarrassing. He embarrasses himself constantly, but at the same time, you realize we all are Larry David. The stuff he says in the show is what we wish we could say, and he never lets things go, which is something a lot of us struggle with. Not to his extent, but you know, I think having such a character like that the audience could relate to, constantly get himself into trouble, honestly never gets old. Okay, moving on, we have Boardwalk Empire, which is a show set in 1920s Atlantic City, where Steve Buscemi plays a bootlegging corrupt politician. Now, it's been a while since I've seen this show, but I remember really liking it a lot. I saw this when I was in high school, so probably, a while ago, like freshman year of high school. I really liked it. The show is cinematically brilliant. It actually makes itself look like it's the 1920s, and you have that like perfect HBO capsule to it. It looks very high quality, which a lot of these HBO shows do. The characters are so entertaining and interesting, and they're bad people, but you feel like glued to the screen watching them anyway. Very similar to The Sopranos, because they have some of the Sopranos writers create their own show, so that you have some similarities there. Except this is set in 1920s, and The Sopranos is set in modern day America. But yeah, very addictive show. I'd say some stuff that happens you don't see coming, and you kind of like to guess what happens next. But yeah, it's very clever. Moving on, we have Big Little Lies, which is based on the book by Liane Moriarty. This show is about a bunch of stuck-up rich moms in Monterey Bay, California, and it's a unique series because it's a murder mystery. But not only do you not know who the killer is, you don't know who the murderer is. So the whole time they're like, somebody died, and you gotta like, then it kind of flashes back and you're watching like, okay, who died? Who did it? What happened? Went down? It's kind of unique in that aspect. Also, they like touch on a lot of subjects like domestic violence and motherhood and stuff that a lot of TV shows don't really talk about. But I found it really interesting, and can't wait for season 3 whenever that comes out in like 10 years. Okay, moving on, we have Succession, which what hasn't been said about that show. Everybody loves it, including myself. Um, it's about a family of rich media mogul assholes, kind of scheming and double crossing each other for power. And I don't know, looks into like all the characters are just such big narcissists and very selfish, irredeemable people, but you're so invested in them anyway. I think that's what a lot of HBO shows do. They present you with these unlikable characters, but kind of force you to start caring about them. That's a theme I've seen when I was making this list. But yeah, the show Succession is very funny. It's hilarious, but also Shakespearean at the same time. Um, yeah, if you haven't seen it, go ahead and watch it. It takes a few episodes to get into, but like once you're into it, you get sucked in like I was. Moving on to My Brilliant Friend, which is based on the Italian book series by Elena Ferrante. This is a Italian show, so it's you watch it with subtitles, but it's very well written. It's set in the 50s and 60s Naples, and it's about these two young girls, later on women, um, and their lives growing up there. They have very struggling lives in post-war Italy, and it's kind of rough. But those two are very smart, so they try to break out of the system to different effects. It's a pretty dark series. There's a lot of mature elements to it, but the friendship between them is so like magnetic that you can't help but watch it and hope for the best for them. Okay, so next up is Chernobyl, which I was so impressed with when this came out. It's such a good show. It's about nuclear, uh, the nuclear meltdown in Chernobyl back in the 80s, and it shows the devastating effects it has on people who were exposed to the radiation and a giant government cover-up. You know, people think I'm crazy for not trusting the government. They're like, oh, of course the government cares about you. But, like, all it takes is to watch shows like Chernobyl or just read into, like, what the CIA has done. And, like, no, the government doesn't care about you. Anyway, the whole thing's about, like, what's the cost of uncovering the truth. And it has such great performances by Jared Harris and Stellan Skarsgård. Um, it's filmed in such this bleak, depressing way. It's a devastating, depressing series, but I think it's a series that needed to be made, and I really enjoyed it, even if there's some parts that made me uncomfortable watching. Okay, up next we have Mayor of Easttown. This is a mini-series starring Kate Winslet, where she has to solve this murder mystery and this teenage abduction mystery, see if they're linked in any way, while also dealing with the aftermath of her son's suicide. So, unlike most cop dramas, this is a very personal story, which I like. You really get to the center of Mare as a person, her strengths, her weaknesses. It's it's not just your one of the mill. We gotta catch the killer show. It's very like mature, and I really like her performance in that show. So he definitely deserved the Emmy for that. And it's a clever show as well. Like I didn't know who the killer was until like the very last minute, and I like when shows keep you guessing like that. Moving on, we have the spin-off to Game of Thrones, which is House of the Dragon. This takes place a couple hundred years before Game of Thrones, and I think it's great. It hasn't had the chance to get bad like Game of Thrones has, but I don't think they'll have that problem because we already know how the story's going to end. As opposed to Game of Thrones, when the creators of that show just had to make it up as they went along because they ran out of source material. So so far, very good show. I'd say it's even darker than Game of Thrones. It's not as explicit, like it's not as explicitly violent, but the things that happen are still very dark and disturbing. But also, you're attached to these, wait for it, unlikable characters. You have all these like cruel characters like Daemon Targaryen that you're like, wow, this guy's a monster, but also I can't look away. It's a great show. All the acting is great. Wait for season 2 next month. Moving on to the most recent show HBO has done that I really enjoyed was The Last of Us. This is based on video games I have not played, so I don't know how accurate or inaccurate it is, but so far I really like it. It's a show about a zombie apocalypse, but instead of focusing on the zombies, it focuses on the humans. For a show about zombies, they only show up in like maybe half the episodes. Most of it is how humanity survives and that willingness to survive no matter what. Looking for something to live for even when you've had everything taken away from you. You have very complex, depressing themes like that. Um, like Joel, he has nothing to live for, but once he meets Ellie, he realizes, maybe not all hope is lost. It's, a lot of dark stuff happens. I feel like children die like every episode, so it's not exactly something you want to watch after a long day of work. It's it's not it's not light viewing. It's a very dark show, but that makes those little sweet moments all the more worth it. And following these characters' journey as they manage to survive and hopefully try to save the world. I'm very excited for season 2. I don't know when that comes out, maybe next year, but either way, great season. And like I said, all 10 shows on this list are great. I highly recommend them. Being HBO, which often pushes boundaries, if you're a little squeamish by things, or you don't like violence or harsh language, then maybe stay away from these shows. But if you're willing to open your mind to such things, I recommend them. What do you have to lose? It's just TV. Well, it's not TV. It's HBO.